Nina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
So, Nina, can you just give a little bit of background about you and how you got into the whole AI issue?
Yes, it's a kind of a long and circuitous story, so I'll try to be brief. My family is Polish and Ukrainian, and so growing up, I had a lot of exposure to history of that part of the world that maybe some others who aren't, from Central and Eastern Europe don't have. My grandfather was actually deported from Poland when he was 10 by the Soviets and spent part of his youth in a gulag. And so learning about
Wow.
that early on in my life really piqued my interest in that part of the world. And so when I got to college, I studied Russian language. I went and studied abroad in St. Petersburg, Russia. I did a double major in political science and then turned that around and said, I really want to keep studying this region. So I went to graduate school at Georgetown and did a master's in Russian and East European studies, went back to Russia, got more kind of enmeshed in the politics of the place. And then my first job out of graduate school was working for the National Democratic Institute, doing democracy support programs for Russia and Belarus. During that time, the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine began, and I was just so, excuse me, captivated by everything going on in Ukraine and really wanted to go out there. I was lucky enough that at the time, the Fulbright Public Policy Program was recruiting. This was a couple years into my working for NDI. And that is such an amazing program because it's not just like you're going to do research or going to do, a teaching gig like most Fulbrighters do. You get to be placed in a ministry. And so I was working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, advising them on strategic communications in 2016 and 2017, when a lot of very interesting things that I had been studying were coming to a head in the US. I came back and started working on my first book, which is How to Lose the Information War. It's all about Russian disinformation and the ways our allies in Central and Eastern Europe dealt with it, their lessons learned and perhaps mistakes to avoid. And then I started looking more at online abuse as well. And there are really two sides to the same coin, particularly when you're talking about online abuse of women or of minorities. There's often a disinformation angle there as well.
Hmm.
And then AI came on the scene. So very early on after I started studying online abuse is when we first started hearing the first kind of titterings of deepfakes and artificial intelligence. And at the time, it wasn't very accessible. It wasn't democratized, although I hate using that word about AI because there's nothing democratic about artificial intelligence. We started to hear kind of people worried about, what will happen if there's an AI deepfake nuclear threat, or if an election is thrown with a deepfake video. And I knew from talking to women around the world that actually the real threat and the very actual threat at that moment wasn't any of the stuff that we would talk about in these boardrooms at think tanks. It was deepfake, non-consensual, image-based sexual abuse. So I'm talking about deepfake
Hmm.
pornography, basically. But folks
Right.
don't like to use that term because pornography is supposed to be consensual, right? And these images are not created that way. And millions of women since that point, which was, God, probably about 8 years ago now, have been victimized and targeted by this stuff. And so that's why I really started getting into it, because early on, I just felt like nobody was discussing the guardrails or the governance or the safety features that these platforms needed to have. And lo and behold, here we are almost a decade later, and the same conversations are still happening. They have not moved. And in many cases, governments, including our own, I think are standing in the way of what are necessary guardrails to protect a lot of the most vulnerable people in society.
Yeah, interesting about guardrails because this is something that a couple of years ago when I first started, well, maybe 5 years ago, I started paying a lot of attention to AI. ChatGPT had just come out. I think it was 1.2 or whatever.
Yeah.
I asked a bunch of questions. I said, does anybody like think about the whole Terminator movie? I mean, the way that we're moving, and they're talking about drones and AI, and where we're at right now is extremely scary, and how quickly we're moving with AI, and we're not thinking of guardrails. And I think about the early internet when they just ran full ahead
Yeah.
with it and didn't have any guardrails in, and there were a lot of young people that were subjected to some extreme levels of abuse that if they would have just spent a little bit of time and put some guardrails in place, they would have never had a problem.
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily a question of time. I think in many cases these platforms know full well what the harms they are causing are, but they're brushing them under the rug in some cases very deliberately, in order to line their own pockets. Right? They make more money off of the things that are more outrageous. The most engaging content is the most enraging content online. When it comes to AI, I don't want to say as I don't want to go as far as to say like these companies are profiting off of things like teen suicides or anything, although we have seen those. But they're certainly profiting off of the sexualization of women, the non-consensual sexualization of women. And that's why you see things like, spicy mode on Grok, or I think it's called erotic mode on ChatGPT being rolled out to paying customers because, they recognize that there's a windfall there. And the question is at whose expense, right? And there is always somebody because whose images are those models trained on that are then producing that content for
Right,
users? So yeah,
right,
it's unfortunately, I think not just a question of not wanting to spend the resources on it. It's also a question of like wanting to increase their bottom.
right, right. So your work at American Sunlight Project, what is the single biggest threat AI poses to local government PIOs trying to maintain single source of truth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that we have seen at ASP is that bad actors are trying to infect large language models with propaganda. And so we noticed this with Russia. They've got a network called the Pravda network that is essentially replicating information many, many times across the internet in a lot of different languages and on a lot of different subdomains. And the idea there is to send a signal to these large language models that this is reliable information. In particular, when you type in a question about breaking news in Ukraine, these models, even though we about a year ago had released this report hypothesizing this is what happened, these models will very frequently still cite the Pravda network as a legitimate source for news about Ukraine. Now, to connect it back to local PIOs, if we have an adversary around a local election or around, let's say, a breaking news event like a natural disaster or some other sort of emergency who really wants to cause havoc, it would be not necessarily trivial, but also not very difficult for these models to accidentally hoover up sources that our adversaries have been cultivating for a long time, sending the signals that these are trustworthy and they're getting picked up by the models. As long as they're able to get the information out there first, there might be a lag in what the PIOs are able to put out and to correct, right? And once that information is in there, it's hard to remove it. I had a similar experience myself where there was a foreign news outlet that quoted me as saying something I had never said. And it got hoovered up by the AI, and the AI was spitting it out as if I had said it. And when I corrected it and linked it to a tweet of mine that said, this is a fake quote, of course, the LLM apologized, right? But at that point, you have people using LLMs as search engines. And so
Yeah.
it's really difficult, again, without those guardrails. Um, and government websites, I think, are fortunately seen as trustworthy sources, at least by the models that most people use here in the United States. But you have to worry about imposters. You have to worry about signals coming from other websites that provide competing or downright false information. And unfortunately, there's not a lot that we can do in terms of flagging that content to the engineers who are controlling that model. And then again, the lag is very difficult to deal
Right.
with in terms of the
And
act.
a lot of local agencies don't have the personnel to even track that stuff as going out. I mean,
Yeah,
you have to have a lot of things going on, and you have to have your own AI bots out there running around looking for your information to
yeah.
verify if it's true or not.
Well, and one of the things that we found also when we were testing our hypothesis about the Pravda network is that you have to dedicate a large amount of time to testing what information is out there. And like, again, as you say, PIOs specialize in information and communications, obviously, but you might not be an expert in LLMs. Sometimes you need to have a subscription to access this stuff. I know how local budgets are. So it's difficult and you can't have your eyes on at all times, right? And unfortunately, we see this more and more frequently where folks who are, they're career folks doing their best, but they're asked to be specialists in something that is a really fast moving area, and their role is ever expanding. So I feel for y'all. I really do.
Right, right. All right, so let me ask you a question as a local thing with deep fakes. As they become, the technology is so fast now and it's so good that it's very difficult to tell that if they're real or not. I mean, I saw a statistic the other day that said right now about 80% of all the video that we're seeing on social media is AI generated. And I was like, "Ooh, that's a high number." But my question is since it's a bigger threat and especially to local governments, how do they address like video or audio content? How can they market so that it's known as authentic or the public knows it's authentic?
Yeah. So the technology for that exists, but it's not very widespread yet. There's a couple of companies and coalitions, in particular, the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is run by Adobe, is pushing for a digital watermark to be appended to images, so you can see how they've been edited, retouched, or in some cases completely AI generated. Unfortunately, we're not at a point where that technology has, again, had the pickup across, different sectors of society and also widespread amongst the population. I don't want to say it's not useful, but it's just not widespread enough yet to be useful. And so I'm hopeful that we will get to the point where PIOs don't need to do very much at all to indicate that to their audiences, because it will just exist within the platforms that you use. And in some cases, I know camera companies have been involved with the Content Authenticity Initiative. So like it'll get appended right to your image as you've created it, for instance. Until then, it's really difficult because fact checking has been so polarized, right? That even if you were to say, okay, this is fake and something else is real, the trust of the population, unfortunately, is never on a government communicator's side, right? So I would rely on third party validators and amplifiers to make those calls or make those fact checks for you rather than trying to do it yourself. Also, as particularly for deepfake video and audio and photo content, it is becoming quite difficult to tell with the naked eye if something is real. Obviously, you have, internal knowledge of like, yes, my principal did this and it happened, or no, it did not. But
Right.
still, that's your word against everyone else's. And so there are companies as well that do verification of footage and audio. I think that most of them do it for a fee. I'm sure there are some nonprofits out there who do it as well, but I think it's unfair of us, of the kind of economy, to rely on a very small echelon of people who are now, they've got the technical skills to do this, when again, if we created policy at a federal level or state level that we're able to equip people with the tools they need, like let's say
Right.
content
Right.
content credentials or watermarks, then we'd be in a different situation. Unfortunately, we're not
Right.
there. And, the 80% statistic doesn't surprise me at all, because what we're seeing is that AI slop in particular, which are like these crazy videos where, it looks like shrimp Jesus, or it's like babies turning into fruit. And like, I mean, I can't even look
Yeah.
away, and I know they're AI. And there's a lot of people, particularly who are most vulnerable to this sort of content, who will just stay there doom scrolling for a long time, right? So the platforms, again, to get back to the conversation we were having earlier, the platforms are benefiting from this stuff, and that's why they're not taking it down,
Absolutely.
because they're finding that it actually increases engagement on the platform, which is a scary thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Nina, earlier you mentioned that government websites are still considered trusted sources of information. And one of the things that when I do training and I do FEMA training for public information officers, one of the things that we always tell people is create during a crisis, have that ready to turn a page on that is the official source of information for that incident. So am I right in telling people to do that?
I
Is that
think
the right thing to
so.
do?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I know from my short time at the Department of Homeland Security that the fact checking and kind of truth communicating efforts that FEMA did, particularly during Hurricane Sandy, they created the first rumor control website, which was um, then copied by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I think, regardless of whether people have flagging trust in local or state or federal government, you need to get out ahead of inevitably what will be an information vacuum. And so having that single source of truth, especially for media, but also for the general public, is a really good thing. And making sure that your SEO is high enough that that's, getting picked up by the search engines. Similarly, doing what you need to do to make sure, and there are all sorts of, I don't even know what they are. I don't have the technical prowess yet, but there are shenanigans going on to make sure that LLMs pick up your material as well. But like making sure that you're up to date with that and that it is getting fed to the right sources where people are actually conducting their searches is really important. But also understanding that the website or the page on the website is not going to be a panacea, and meeting people where they are. Like maybe people aren't looking at whatever your local government website is, but if you've got a, let's say, an Instagram or a TikTok page, and you have one of your PIOs get out there in front of the camera and say, "Hey, my name is Larry. I'm your neighbor here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and here's what we've got for you today." That is a highly effective way to meet people where they are and make sure that, you're communicating that information in a lot of different fora. And I know it's exhausting because whenever I put out a new article or I've got something to say, I've got to do it in 17 different places as well. But I do find, especially right now, because the internet has really become very bifurcated, that like the audiences on
Hmm.
these platforms are completely different. The people who watch me on Instagram are not the same as those who follow me on Substack, as those who follow me on Blue Sky, right? So it's worth doing. And I always just try to repeat to myself, like, these are all different audiences. I'm not just repeating myself. And I think that's a good thing to remember as well, because it's not really an if you build it, they will come sort of scenario. Like we need to go to
Right.
where the people are.
Okay. So you advise the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry on strategic comms. What is a wartime lesson about information speed and accuracy that translates to a municipal PIO during a crisis?
Ooh, okay. I've got a great one for this. Um, I worked with the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she had a lot of international media coming to her asking her for comment on things. And local government, like the Ukrainian government, sometimes has a lot of bureaucracy, where you need to get clearances on things before you talk to a reporter. You need to have clear talking points, et cetera, et cetera. In Ukraine, it was very similar, where my boss would need, if she didn't already have cleared lines on a new nascent topic that came up in the ministry, she would need to route for clearance new talking points. And that would look like a press officer sending a request to the right desk, like regional desk within the building, to draft those talking points, it getting the necessary stamps, which hopefully we don't have to deal with in the US, but is very much still a cultural thing in Ukraine. And then those points getting drafted, it getting sat on someone's desk, they write it, they send the points back to their boss, it gets another stamp, it goes back all the way to the press office. And then finally, 2 weeks later, they're ready to answer the question, right?
Right.
Information moves much, much quicker than that now. And so, to the extent that people can be empowered to make judgment calls within these offices based on their best understanding of the situation and the best understanding of the position of the government at the time. That is critical. And we've seen this change under the Zelensky administration. So when I worked in Ukraine, it was the Poroshenko administration. In 2019, Zelensky was elected. And part because of his background as an entertainer, right? He didn't have kind of that staid way of communicating as government communicators often do. And he also really empowered people, especially when the war broke out, when Russia attacked Ukraine. You didn't see Ukrainian government ministries always operating in sync, but it's not like there was daylight between them, if you know what I mean. Like they
Hmm.
kind of let people go out and flourish and share the content that they wanted to share and communicate how they wanted to communicate. And I'm not aware of any major clashes where, because they didn't run something up to the presidential administration, something bad happened. I think given the nature of the communications that they needed and that high pressure environment where information was flowing so quickly, the presidential administration really understood and empowered people to communicate. And I think we in the States are still struggling with that. And maybe we need
Yes,
some
we
sort of
are.
crisis to kind of kick us into high gear. I'm not wishing one upon us. We don't need another pandemic, but
No,
it's a lesson
no.
hard to learn. And like we don't need to be clearing every tweet that goes out, right? We need to empower people to build up staff so that they can make those decisions and communicate as they are meant to do as professional communicators. And we haven't quite done that yet. So that is the lesson I learned in
Right. Excellent. All right. So in your book, How to Lose the Information War, you mentioned that the most effective disinformation has a kernel of truth.
Mm.
How can the PIO identify that kernel early before they're weaponized into that full blown narrative?
This is a great question. Um, Generally, I don't think it's not like you can predict like this kernel will be one that is weaponized, but generally it is the most polarizing issues in our society, the hot button issues that bad actors seize upon. And I have to say, those are bad actors abroad, and there are bad actors who are looking for power and for profit here at home as well. And so you can't necessarily predict which hot button issue will be the one that goes. But if I can direct your listeners to a great resource by a guy named Ben Nimmo, who now incidentally works for OpenAI on threats and security, but he used to work for Meta doing counter disinformation work, particularly with Russia. Ben Nimmo created something called the breakout scale. And if you search Ben Nimmo breakout scale, it'll come up. And it's 5 stages of a narrative breaking out into the public. And one is when you've got the narrative in one community, just a couple of posters on one platform. And then it goes up by levels. And it's like, okay, now it's in multiple platforms or multiple communities. Okay, now it's breaking out on multiple platforms at a higher level. Now it is on mainstream news networks. And then level 5, so it goes 1 through 5. Level 5 is where the narrative is causing either a policy response or real world violence or repercussions. And if you've gotten to level 5, you've messed up. Uh, you've waited too long, and I think ideally you want to, like, depending on the comfort of your organization and what you deal with, what sorts of issues you deal with, and the impacts, like, you probably want to intervene somewhere 2 or 3. The problem with the
Okay.
internet age is that things go from 1 to 5 really quickly. So from my personal experience, when I was appointed to lead the Disinformation Governance Board at DHS during the Biden administration, and folks started lying that I would be censoring the internet, which was a total fabrication. It went from the announcement of the board, which we can talk about in detail if you like, was done very poorly, not enough information, not enough third party validators. I wouldn't have done it that way if it had been wholly up to me. But it went from the announcement to the board of the board to a massive an influencer with a massive audience talking about it within 6 hours. And then the next day it was on national nightly news. So, like, it was
Wow.
0 to 100 and the department was just deer in headlights. And I think I will say, I don't know if this was a Biden administration thing or if this is a government communicator thing. I think maybe a little bit of both, but at least in among the government folks that I've spoken to, there is this tendency to believe that the internet is not real life. And it clearly is. We know we need to
Yeah.
not treat it as like a curiosity and instead treat it as an important source of information that not only drives policy, but drives trust. And if we don't pay attention to what people are saying on the internet, then we can end up in situations like the one that I was in, which was within that 24-hour period. I was pregnant at the time. My husband and I started receiving threats. Eventually, our home address was leaked, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle once it happens. So you want to
Right.
anticipate that stuff. And part of that is having good, ongoing information analysis, sentiment analysis, having somebody who looks at that stuff if you have the resources, and then knowing ahead of time what that tripwire is based on that breakout scale that I mentioned. It's very important.
Okay. I will. I just pulled it up, so I will link that into the show notes when we do
Awesome.
when I put the episode up. All right. So here's a question. You've been the center of the high. You've talked about it. It's a high profile digital attacks for PIOs who often face trolls or we get coordinated harassment on social media. It's a very common. What are your top 3 digital hygiene tips from how to be a woman online?
Yeah, it's a great question. The thing that makes me really sad about all of this is people who are civil servants who just want the best for their communities, who are doing their jobs because they are the person who's interfacing with the public, are frequently now, as you say, being attacked in really, really, I think, disgraceful ways. Often that have impacts on their personal lives and their families. The most important thing that we can all be doing, and I know this is just like gonna I can hear the eyes rolling already, but you need to have complex passwords and two-factor authentication on your accounts. And that's not just for your work account. It needs to be on all your personal social media. It needs to be on your personal email, especially your bank stuff. But this is the easiest way that somebody can gain access to your personally identifiable information and either embarrass or kind of ruin your life in other ways. So that is the most important thing. The other thing that I think is important for all government servants at any level to think about these days, again because of the increase of these attacks, is to invest in, or if you can convince your boss to make it a budget line item, to scrub personal information from the internet. I think it's an investment worth making. You can do this yourself. It just is very time consuming. So I prefer, particularly if you've got multiple people in your family, different names and addresses, you want to make sure that all those folks are scrubbed as well. So your children, your spouse, anybody that lives with you, or at addresses that you used to live. And for that, I go to Delete Me, which is one of the more well known
Hmm.
services there, and they do a good job. There's
Yeah.
other ones as well. There's one called Canary with a K, or Incogni. They're all good, and they do the same thing, which is they remove your phone number and address from data brokers websites, because there are people out there who are selling access to that information. So
Right.
that's number
Right.
2. And then the third thing, when you're in the day to day with trolls, recognizing that what they want is oxygen from you. They want you to either, from an official account, they want you to block them, or they want you to react in some way. The best thing that you can do for yourself is to just mute them. I love the image of these trolls just shouting into the abyss, right? You don't want to see that yourself. You don't have to be exposed to every nasty comment that somebody sends to you. But if you're able to mute them, they don't know that they've been muted. The stuff goes out into the abyss and you don't have to see it anymore. And then increasingly, with like the sentiment analysis tools that are being developed and brought to market now, you can look at that stuff and have a good idea of what people are saying, but not be exposed to all those individual tidbits thanks to artificial intelligence, right? It can look at all that stuff for you and make sure that you know what's up, but you don't have to read through every single horrible thing that somebody says about your organization. So yeah, top 3, they're pretty easy, but I continue to be dismayed at the number of people who don't have two-factor or multi-factor on their accounts. It blows my mind.
I do, and I've learned that one from a long time ago when I had a very basic account get hacked, and now I use two factor on everything, and the agencies that I work for all require it, and sometimes it's very time consuming to
Yes.
log in, but it's well worth it in the long run, so I don't have to worry about something getting stolen.
Yeah,
All right, so
absolutely.
yeah,
I was just
it
gonna
really
say,
is.
the other thing is with personal accounts, it tends to be a little less time consuming than the government stuff. I'd like to refer to it as like set it and forget it. Once you've got your preferred method of your second or third factor, as long as you don't remove the app or completely log out, like you usually don't have to do it too frequently. I think people are afraid and they think it's going to be this big burden, but I think it's so highly worth it.
I tell my wife this all the time. I'm gonna log out of everything. I go, you have two factor authentication. You've just verified the computer. You put all that information in. You're good.
Yeah.
You don't have to. I'm logging out. So she's freaked out about it, and that's okay. Better to be safe than sorry, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Here's a question. Trolls now are using AI to create hundreds of sites that are lookalike, legitimate news outlets, what they often call pink slime sites. When a fake like Springfield Gazette pops up and starts scraping your official press releases while twisting the headlines. How can what recourse does a municipality have, or what action can they take to address it?
Whew, that's a tough one. There's not much that I don't I would recommend doing in that situation, actually. And a friend of mine just wrote a great expose on pink slime sites, and they are still alive and kicking. That is for sure. They pretty much exist as clickbait to take press releases, to take video appearances of officials who are maybe not giving the most eloquent answer to something, and they chop them up and they try to make them as embarrassing as possible. Similar thing with the press releases, the spin on that is meant to drive clicks, right? And so I don't think that you would want to respond directly and say, the Springfield Gazette is taking our words out of context, because then you're going to be fanning the flames. sending
fueling it,
people
right?
to the Springfield Gazette. But again, that's where, you might want to look at the breakout scale and say, okay, is it just the Springfield Gazette reporting this, or now has it broken out to multiple communities and multiple platforms? And then you might want to issue some sort of statement. But I would leave the pink slime site out of it. In terms of other recourse, unfortunately, legally, there's not much that you can do. But one thing that I've learned as I have learned about defamation law through my own experience, sending a letter that has a request for correction, or an email as the request for correction, is something you can do that sort of protects your rights. Not that governments are able to sue in these cases, they're not, but still asking for that request for correction, providing the evidence necessary that the outlet, such as it is, might make that amendment, and then at least you've got that paper trail that you've done that, and you can share that with your own
Right.
followers, your own constituents as well. But yeah, it's a difficult issue, and what we really need is more investments in media literacy and information literacy, but that costs money, and we aren't building up programs like that in the United States right now, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to
No, we're
see it.
not. We're not. No, we're not. I was talking about internet literacy years ago when I was doing it for kids, and they still don't have anything that's really worthwhile out of it. So,
Yeah.
all right, so let's talk about this. You called AI an intern rather than an expert. What's that one task a PIO should never delegate to their AI intern?
Well, I think, you would never allow your intern to write something, let's say a press release or something like that, without checking it over first, right? I think everybody wants AI to do their work for them. And in reality, it hallucinates, it makes up sources, it makes up quotes. You have to really check every output with a fine tooth comb. And then even, one of the things I like to use AI for, and I've mentioned this a little bit before, combing through large data sets. It's a good thing, particularly when you're dealing with either a huge data set or something that you don't want to be exposed to at a granular level, but you still do have to conduct quality checks there. And so I will go through and, every 25th row of a large spreadsheet, just check if it assessed the sentiment in a piece of content correctly or labeled it correctly, et cetera, because again, it makes mistakes. You can teach it, but it's never foolproof. And so I think that's the best thing. I would also say that in general, even though an LLM can write a pretty decent press release, it's going to miss what makes you and your organization special. And I'm sure your listeners have encountered these very clearly AI generated paragraphs or press releases where you don't
Yeah.
want to sound like everybody else, particularly when you're dealing with the press or your local community. You want to connect with people. And so preserving that humanity is really important. But yeah, in general, anything that you wouldn't let an intern do without some supervision, don't let your AI do either.
Yeah, I agree. If you could give every PIO a digital bug out bag, what are the three tools that they should have inside of it?
Ooh, so I like a tool called Block Party, which it's basically an online privacy and safety tool that was developed by somebody like me who has dealt with a lot of trolling and nastiness online, and it automates. In its earlier incarnations, used to automate blocking and muting of people. I think now they do have that access back to the Twitter API. It's not on every platform, but the other thing that it does that's really useful is conduct a privacy checkup on all of your social media accounts. So I would do that both with your work accounts if you're able to connect it without violating any policies, but also your personal accounts, because again, increasingly civil servants are being targeted with hate and harassment offline. So making sure that you don't have any errant pictures of your kids or your dog with its dog tags facing out on Facebook, things like that. That's what Block Party can do. So that's number one. I suppose the other thing, I use a VPN a lot, particularly when I'm traveling, just to make sure that my web traffic is the sites that I'm looking at aren't being viewed by somebody else. I have a little bit more of a strange kind of viewpoint on this because I am still sometimes receive notifications that a state sponsored actor like Russia is trying to access my messages and my browsing history from Google. So perhaps that one is a little bit weird, but that's me. And let's see, what else do I use? I'm having trouble coming up with a third one. Uh, I mean, I guess just
It was good.
your physical two-factor authentication is your gold standard there. Although I mea culpa, I very frequently travel without it, and then sometimes I get screwed. Always make sure you've got it in your bag.
Absolutely. All right, Nina, in 2026, is transparency enough to win the information war, or do we need something more aggressive?
No, transparency has been weaponized now, unfortunately. We see very frequently both local agencies, public universities, government agencies at the federal level being subject to what I would call not frivolous, but adversarial Freedom of Information Act requests that are burying people under, a ton of admin. And generally, what comes out of these requests is not a fulsome investigative report. It is conspiracy theorists with red string corkboards who cut the slice and dice emails, communications, Teams messages, what have you, to make it seem like something nefarious has happened when it really isn't. And this is the whole story behind the Twitter files and all of the allegations of
Hmm.
censorship that have been bubbling up for so long now. A lot of these folks will release very dense looking reports, but when you look at the actual communications themselves, and anybody, can do this, you see that they're a nothing burger, that they've been contextualized, much like the press release that you mentioned before by a Slime website, as something nefarious when it's just government employees having a conversation. It's just social media companies or academics having a conversation like anybody does. So transparency has become a weapon in this era, and people see everything through the lens that they've been primed to see it through. And that's why I think I always go back to another government communicator from the UK who said to me when we were working in Ukraine that the best antidote to disinformation is the truth well told, right? To be able to tell a good story, to be able to connect with people. And I think often, particularly in government communication, we forget that because we think we have to stay in kind of stodgy government speak. But ultimately, your job is to like reach out to your constituents in your local community and make them understand the work that you do. And if you have to do that by throwing some Gen Z slang in or, communicating in a slightly less formal way, I think that's a good thing. And too frequently we fall back on what we think we should be, the image we think we should be projecting rather than the one that people want to hear from.
Nina, I really appreciate that. Truth well told. I love that. That's perfect for a PIO. I
Yeah.
love that. That's awesome. Is there a question I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered?
I can't think of anything. Um,
Okay. No, I threw a lot at you, but we still got more to go though. So let's go to some rapid fire questions. These are kind of fun, lighten things up a little bit. Phone call, voice memo, FaceTime. What's your go-to?
Voice memo. I love getting voice memos that are like totally unhinged from my good friends and listening to them when I'm like on a walk or in the car. They're the best.
I get a birthday message from a friend of my wife's every year, and it's this crazy phone call message, and it just makes you smile every time she does it. So I completely get it. Streaming binge or weekend read. What's your ideal escape?
Definitely, I'm a reader. I don't watch a lot of TV.
Morning ritual: sunrise, workout, quiet coffee, or news scroll.
More of a quiet coffee type of person. I'm working on a new book right now, and so I will get my coffee, and then I come in my pajamas like a little hobbit, and I sit here and write for a couple of hours. That's my best time in the morning. But if I'm not working on a project, then I don't mind getting a workout in early. But usually I will sit and have a coffee and write in my journal before that.
Nice. What's one song that always gets you moving, no matter the mood?
Oh, lately my son and I have been having freeze dance parties in the kitchen to Funky Town,
Nice.
which is the throwback to my to my own childhood. He really likes when the little beep beep happens at the beginning of
Yep.
the first chorus. Yeah,
Totally get
Funky
it.
Town, it's a good one.
I get it. If you could adopt a real animal or a mythical one, what would it be?
Oh, I think we're getting a dog soon, so it's going to be a dog. We're getting a puppy. I just saw a very cute puppy that it was
Awesome.
like a shepherd puppy with blue eyes, and I was like, "That's it, that's the one." But I think she probably got adopted already. We're not quite ready yet, but soon.
I get it. I get it. Especially when you have young kids, you got to find the right time.
Yes.
Teleportation or time travel, which power would you like?
I think for the season of life that I'm in, it would be teleportation, just so that I don't have to do so many long haul flights, being away from my family, be able to go back and forth without all the jet lag.
Yeah, that would be nice. Play it safe or roll the dice. What's your instinct in a crisis?
Ooh, I think I'm a roll of dice girl. I think playing it safe gets us into a lot of quagmires, especially in comms.
Yep, well, I'll agree with you on that. Which historical figure would you want to shadow for a day, not just meet?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll say Marie Curie. I think her life must have been very
Hmm.
interesting, although I'll bring some sort of anti-radiation cloak if I'm going to go back in time to meet her.
Right, right. All right. So, any key points you'd like to listeners to take from today's interview?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to know, especially with the way that information moves right now, is that if you don't put information out, then that information vacuum will be filled and the narrative will not be one that you like. And I think we have a tendency in government communications to just hope something will blow over, but the internet is forever. Especially in this day and age, these narratives come back around again and again and again. So the sooner that you can get out information, communicate it truthfully, tell a good story, I think the better off you'll be. You may not win every battle, but at least you'll be on the right side.
I wish every chief or sheriff or whoever executive from a community could hear this because most PIOs I know want to get that information out. It's
Yeah,
always the executives that kind of say, no, we're going to wait.
I know.
Yeah.
Amen. I understand that, but y'all are doing really important work.
As we wrap this up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto you live by?
There's a specific one, although I do have these coasters on my desk that I got from fact checkers in Georgia, the country, not the state. One of them is a Mark Twain quote, and it says, "It's easier to fool people than convince them that they have been fooled," which I like to remember when I'm arguing with people on the internet. And the other one
Hmm.
is from Hannah Arendt, and it says, "Freedom of opinion is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed." And so, in those dark moments where I'm like, why am I pushing this boulder up the hill like Sisyphus? Then I turn to those quotes. I mean, I think it's important. It's a struggle. These struggles are new. They're different because of technology. It makes the work all that more important, and it's an honor to do it. So those help me kind of see the light.
Nina, thank you. How can people best reach you if they want to connect or follow up or want to bring you out to speak at a conference?
Well, they can find how to contact me at my website, which is just ninajankowicz.com. I'm on a smattering of social media, as I said. So if you're on Blue Sky, I'm on there at Nina Jankowicz. I'm on Instagram at Wikipedia, WICZIPEDIA. And then I've got a Substack called The Wayfinder, which is at thewayfinder.net. And so I'm on Substack as well, but I send out a weekly guide to our toxic information environment to my readers there, and it's a lot of fun. We do Q&As. I do interviews with people who are
Awesome.
who are in this. Yeah, that's the best way to reach me. I got two books. They're wherever books are sold. You can find them also on Kindle. How to Lose the Information War and How to Be a Woman Online. And there will be a new book coming in the coming month
And
to a year.
I will add all that onto the show notes and link all that back to your website and everything.
Amazing,
So if people need to get a hold of you or they want to buy your book, they'll be able to do that. And
wonderful.
I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure, Robert. Thanks to you and to all the PIOs for the important work they do informing our publics.